We've been doing a lot of shows recently on mental health, and this week we'll talk about an extreme case, bipolar disorder. I wanted to share with you before we jump into the show some suicide stats, which are pretty shocking, and I think most people don't realize what's going on. This varies dramatically country by country. I have some pretty good stats from the US. If you look at other countries, it can be even higher, and then of course, some countries it's a lot lower. Suicide's the 10th leading cause of death in the U.S. There's 44,000 deaths each year, almost 45,000, which is very similar to the number that happen in car accidents. For every successful suicide, 25 people attempt. More women attempt than men, but more men are successful. Suicide costs the U.S. $69 billion annually. Firearms account for 51% of all suicides. That was at least a couple years ago. And so in general, we're looking at about 123 per day just in the U.S. So the highest rated, basically the highest risk group is middle-aged men, and especially white men. What do all these stats mean? They mean a bunch of things. They mean that your Facebook page has probably been lit up with different cases that have happened in the past year. It probably means that someone in your immediate family or in your in-laws is suffering from pretty bad mental illness. And it might be depression, it might be anxiety, it might be bipolar disorder, it might be something like attention deficit disorder, or it might be something else altogether. But mental health is a big, big problem that not enough people are talking about. And I think even more importantly, we just don't have really great tools to deal with it. Most people just want to take a break or, take a sabbatical or get medicated. And all of those might be good parts of a solution, but none of those are really a holistic solution. And things can go sideways very, very quickly, as you've heard just from the stats here. On this week's show, again, we'll be talking about an extreme case, but I would encourage you to really pay attention and look closely at what's going on in your life and the life of loved ones around you, because I'm guessing that with just 1 degree of separation, someone you know right now is in a pretty bad place, and there's probably some simple things you can do that will help. Probably the most important and most significant you could do right now is pick up the phone, give them a call, and have a listen. I'd love to hear your thoughts, questions, comments on this show. You can always email me, podcast@yogabody.com. So hello and welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Lucas Rockwood Show. Today's show is called Mental Health, a Global Health Crisis. I am joined here with Mark Lukach. Mark is a teacher, a writer. He's the author of the international best-selling memoir, My Lovely Wife in the Psych Ward. His work has been published in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Pacific Standard, Wired, and other publications. He's currently the 9th grade dean at the Athenian School, where he also teaches history. He lives with his wife, Julia, and their son in the San Francisco Bay Area. Am I saying your wife's name right, Mark?
You're saying it right. Yeah, it's Italian, so it's spelled in a way that people don't recognize. But yeah, it's just pronounced Julia.
And you can connect with Mark at his website, which is his full name, marklukach.com, and I'll link up in the show notes. It's a tricky one to spell. Mark, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Lucas. I really appreciate it.
Maybe we can start in the middle. You've dealt with a really challenging mental health challenge in your family, and while that might sound like a rare thing to some people listening, the reality is mental health is a huge crisis all over the place. The stats that I've seen in the U.S. are that, 1 in 4 women are medicated and probably 1 in 4 men should be. And so this is something that's happening all over the place, whether it's depression, anxiety, sleeping disorders, bipolar disorders. So I thought maybe we could kind of start in the middle. From all of the experiences that you've had in your life and with your family, how do you know when someone needs help versus when someone's just down? I mean, obviously life has ups and downs. That's kind of natural. How do you know when somebody really needs help, when it's really just a problem and not just a bad week, a bad month, a bad year?
I think that's a question a lot of people ask. That's certainly a question I was asking when my wife was first starting to show symptoms of her anxiety and depression. And the thing I have to say is I don't want this to come across as a cop-out. I just don't think there's one universal answer, because the biggest thing that I've learned in the 8 years since Julia was first diagnosed and meeting with a ton of people who have experienced mental illness, it's that everyone's brain is unique. I mean, that's such a cliche, but it's really true. And so a label like depression or bipolar disorder, that's a label that we affix onto a collection of symptoms, but it can look so different to each person. And so I think what's at the core of trying to navigate whether this is just something that's temporary or this is maybe something that feels a little bit more real, is listening to the person and really spending time with them and not necessarily rushing to fix things, but just dedicating to actually sitting down, spending time with the person and just hearing how they're feeling and what they're going through and what their thinking process is. And I think that in itself is a really revealing experience, because then you get, if you're willing to go in without an agenda and without this like arm sleeves rolled up, I'm going to go in and save this situation, but instead just more with a lot more humility and patience, I think you're going to learn a ton and be able to navigate things a lot better.
I don't know a lot about mental health, but unfortunately I've had some direct experiences with friends and family members and things like that, and certainly my own challenges, but nothing too severe. But some of the things that I've read, which I think are just important for people to think about, is when a loved one is showing some telltale signs like lack of personal hygiene, failure in very key areas like, not showing up to work, not getting out of bed, self-harming thoughts or words, things like this. I think sometimes people don't know how to think about that. To give you a specific example, a colleague actually was telling me that one of their relatives was sort of having thoughts about self-harm and speaking about it. And their theory was that if you speak about it, it's not going to happen. It must not be real. And from what I've read, it's been absolutely the opposite. And so I'm just curious, that's kind of what I was touching on in terms of that first question. Are there some warning signs that people should, if they're experiencing this in their lives, that they should for sure look out for?
Yeah, well, so first off, I just want to share how difficult it is to be the family member who hears those hard things. My wife, who I met when we were 18, got married when we were 24, and we sort of had this fairy tale life together. When she very unexpectedly had a psychotic break and was talking about killing herself, and then was depressed and was fixated on jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge. I mean, that sort of stuff is absolutely gut-wrenching to hear as a husband who loves this person so much, I think that what's really challenging about that is because it's so scary and hard to hear those things, the natural reaction, I think, is to suppress what that person is saying, right? So like Julia would say, I'm not, there's no reason to live. I'm not going to make it. I'm going to kill myself by the end of the year, for example. And I'd be like, no. You're fine. We have such an amazing future to look forward to. Everything's going to be okay. And I sort of thought that was like a little spark of a fire, and I had to be the fire extinguisher to put it out, right? And I had to learn over time that I couldn't be a fire extinguisher. In fact, what was most important is that I actually do believe that if you are in a physical space with someone and they are talking about these difficult things, they're just words. The person, as long as you're with them and you can monitor them and you know that they are in fact physically safe, then it's okay to let them give voice to these really hard feelings. And in fact, it does sort of help them exercise the feelings a little bit. At least that's been my experience with Julia. But I do think that in absolutely all situations, safety has to be first. And I've been in situations with my own wife, and I certainly know others who have felt that the person they love is unsafe. And if that's the case, then you need help. I think that's the litmus test above all else. If you're worried that they're going to do something, then you have to act immediately, because you need to keep that person alive. The feelings that they have are temporary. There's a famous saying, suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. So you need to make sure that you can avoid that permanent solution. And then the long-term how to get back to feeling better, that could be a long, bumpy road, but at least you're able to keep them safe in that immediate crisis.
How do you come about the decision to share this story with the world? It's deeply personal and painful, and your family and your kids will read it and all these kinds of things. How did you get to that place where you think of like, do we keep this just within our family? Do you share it? What was that decision like?
Yeah, so you open with these stats, right? So like the stat I've read is 1 in 4 American families faces mental illness, right? And so I would visit Julia in the psychiatric hospital every day, and I'd be one of only a few visitors, and I'd check the guest book, and it would be my name and then my name the next day, and then my name the next day, with very few people breaking it up. And it felt like I was the only person in the world who was facing what I was facing. I thought I was, because I couldn't find anything online. I couldn't find any books. I couldn't find any support groups. I couldn't find any of that, right? It just felt like this is something that no one is talking about. And yet for me, it was undoubtedly the most painful and traumatizing experience I've ever been through. I mean, to see this beautiful woman who I love go from totally successful and kicking butt at work to all of a sudden, not sleeping, not eating, having religious delusions, ending up locked up in a psychiatric facility, right? Because she's deemed a threat to herself. Like that is so disorienting, And so of all the many challenges for what that was, there was this extra layer added on, which was a sense of loneliness. And I think that last layer is an illusion, because we're not alone facing this, right? There are so many people who go through these challenges, and I think we might be ashamed, we might just be too overwhelmed to talk about it. But as Julia got better and we sort of figured out a path through stability, we both kind of came to this conclusion together that if we were willing to share this story, it could be a help. Like it could help, whether it's the person who's on Julia's side of the equation and going through the challenges, or the family member who's trying to care for it and feels like they've never heard anyone out there sort of like validating their experience by talking about it publicly. And so once we went from there, I first wrote about this in the New York Times, and that article so many people read that and emailed that, because it was all of a sudden there was a voice speaking about the experience that I think is really common, but so under discussed.
How do you draw the line? Because a lot of people who are down, things make sense. I guess I want to set the stage for when problems really started for you, because you mentioned kind of a fairy tale life, everything was going really well. I think a lot of people who are struggling with mental health issues, it totally makes sense, right? They've lost their job, they have financial struggles, they just lost a relative or whatever it was. But when things went downhill for you guys, were things really okay?
Yeah. So Julia she, like I said, kind of hinted at, she's an incredibly successful girl. Like we met in college and she had like a near perfect GPA, right? And had all these amazing internships. And then when we got married, she got a job almost immediately and everyone loved her. And so hers was kind of triggered by starting a new job. And it was a job where she felt intimidated by how smart the people around her were. And that just triggered something. Now, I do not think that her job caused Julia to have bipolar disorder. I think that the circumstances we were in, for whatever reason, triggered this illness that had been dormant for a while, So it's this really complicated balance, I think, between a lot of things, like environmental factors such as work or stress, which are obviously real, and you need to manage those. But there's also the question of what's going on chemically inside your brain. And I also think it's worth validating, like what's going on maybe on a more existential or even spiritual level inside a person, like those I don't think are irrelevant. I've kind of fallen down that like mental illness is not exclusively a chemical thing. It's not exclusively an environmental thing. It's a really complicated blend of all of those things. So that's why, like my earlier answer, it's really hard to have a universal answer for what these experiences look like, because everyone's is so different. Sure. And I think that's where it becomes frustrating too, because I had to learn that psychiatry and mental health care is not like physical health care. Like if I go break my arm, I'm going to go into the doctors. They're going to put me in a cast. They're going to say 6 to 8 weeks, you can take this off. It should be fine, But if you go in and like with Julia, you're having delusions, there's a humongous spectrum of what might be causing that and what might be the best way to deal with it. And it's kind of a scientific guessing game of treating, okay, maybe this pill is going to work, but okay, it didn't work, so we got to try a different one. And maybe there's depression mixed in, or maybe not. And so I think I had this expectation that it was very simple. You have a cold, you take Benadryl, you're going to be better. But that's not the case at all. It's more like you're in this amorphous situation, and we're going to go in with best intentions and try our best using research. But ultimately, the brain is a gigantic mystery. And so it might take a really long time, and we might, but we're optimistic we're eventually going to get there. We just don't know when or how.
The term psych ward, for most people, just conjures up, visions from movies and things. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest or something like this. But I think most people listening have definitely never been to a psych ward. So what does it actually look like? What are those? Are those public facilities? Are they private facilities?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's funny because our first hospital did feel like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I mean, Julia's been hospitalized 3 different times, and each one was pretty different because our insurance provider has a hospital, but not their own inpatient facility. So we went to the ER, and they basically find us a nearby hospital that had a bed for Julia. And so the first, which was in San Francisco, I mean, had bars on the windows and was like poorly lit with fluorescent lighting and, and just really drab and not at all an uplifting place. I mean, they had this tiny little courtyard that you could go outside. I think it was like 45 minutes at a time, but it was basically just walls, The second hospital she was at was outside the city. It was logistically way more complicated for me because it was almost an hour away. And we had a 5.5-month-old at that time. But as far as the facility itself, it was way more welcoming. I mean, there was windows everywhere that were open and bright. You could always had access to the outdoors. There was these like nice garden spaces. So you could just go sit outside, And I think that the second facility acknowledges, I think, what is the complexity that I was getting at of like what's causing all these things. And if you're not entirely sure what's causing them, you should keep yourself open to all sorts of potential aids and solutions. And I'm a big believer for my own self-care in getting outdoors and being amongst green things, you know what I mean? And how helpful that is to just lift my spirits. And so for the second hospital, Julia, almost every time I had a visitor, she'd be sitting outside like under a tree. And I think that's a great comfort, to be able to have that stuff. So it depends on the hospital, but I think that regardless, there's so much emotion to be there admitting one of your loved ones that it feels like an incredibly scary place. And Julia's been hospitalized 3 times. The first time was 23 days. The second time was 33 days. And the third time was 13 days. So if you add that all up, I have visited a psychiatric hospital for about 2 months in total, And it takes that long, I think, to lose that edge of fear that the place communicates, just because it's just difficult, you're sitting there, you feel helpless, you're watching your loved ones suffer in ways that that don't make sense to you. And so the buildings themselves are one thing, but I think that there's the emotion that we attach to them just because of what kind of experiences happen there,
And what is the daily protocol like? Are they meeting with a therapist every day? Is there group therapy? Is it just depend on the patient?
Yeah, great question too. The typical day, it's like sort of everything is opt in, opt out. I mean, she did have standard meetings that she had to go to with doctor and nurses and stuff like that. But it would sort of be like a mix of, okay, group therapy, maybe from like 10 to 11, and then maybe some sort of art therapy where they do like an art project, and then, downtime. And then usually, though, what was so surprising to me is how limited visiting hours are. I mean, visiting hours are pretty much contained to about an hour or an hour and a half a day at a set time. And, I sort of, when we went into this having no clue, I kind of thought, well, I'd be allowed to stay for hours on end, But instead, it's a pretty narrow window where all the visitors sort of shuffle together and wait in the waiting room and then go in together and then leave together. But so I never actually got to experience too much the daily regimen, but I just know that it's a hybrid of stuff that you can do if you want to do it, and otherwise stuff that you are required to do, check-ins with doctors, stuff like that.
I'm just curious, you said 5-month-old, I'm guessing work got all messed up. I'm guessing medical bills were huge. How did this disrupt life in terms of finances and home stability and all that kinds of things? Did everything just blow up?
Well, that was something we clearly were worried about, but fortunately, Julia was on insurance through all 3 of her hospitalizations. And because she's, she works hard and does well in her job, she was able to have some sort of work protection and disability because she was leaving for a medical reason. And so this certainly was a situation where we lost money, but fortunately this wasn't something that bankrupted us, And I very much had that fear. I mean, the first episode, we were child-free, and Julia and I, in our first 3 years of marriage, we saved pretty aggressively because we kind of had this vision of buying a house and, saving for future kids' college education. And, I'll be honest, I threw a lot of money at the problem. I paid for my own therapy because I needed that to support myself. When Julia got out of the hospital, I paid for a lot of additional support for her so that I could feel supported. And so we certainly dipped into those savings, but I know that chronic illness of any kind, whether it's mental illness or physical illness, can be devastating if you don't have the right insurance and if insurance isn't willing to pay for it. I mean, we've been really lucky. Julia's been in I can't even imagine how expensive it is to be admitted in the psych ward, but our deductible's been pretty small. And then because of how severe her crises are, they generally are willing to say, this person needs additional support. And so insurance doesn't really ask any questions. They just sort of keep her going along. In fact, I've had the opportunity, I was invited to go and speak at the hospital where Julia was actually cared for. And they asked me, they're like, we want you to be real. Tell us what went well and tell us what didn't go well. And one of the biggest kudos I had to give them was they were willing to offer as much care as she needed without just passing the bill to us, so that was really fortunate for us.
When I was about 19, 20 years old, a close friend of mine was diagnosed bipolar, and he was put on lithium, and this was 20 years ago. I'm curious, what is the medication stack like these days? Is it similar? Has it changed a lot? Does it really just depend on the patient?
Well, that's interesting too. So there's basically, most medications are considered either new or old. That's literally what they call them, because it's kind of like meds that were invented in the 50s and 60s and then meds that were invented in the 80s and 90s. And they're basically just newer versions of the old stuff. I mean, lithium is actually nothing more than a salt tablet. It's a type of salt. And that's actually the same medication that my wife takes that works really well for her. And I think, I don't remember the exact specifics, but they just realized this salt, which was at one point experimented as a replacement to table salt, has mood stabilizing properties, as compared to antipsychotics. Now, psychosis is, that's the name for when you're experiencing delusions and extreme paranoia and sort of racing thoughts. And my wife, she has experienced psychosis before, and the medications that treats that are called antipsychotics, and they're supposed to basically suppress the psychosis. And the older pills tend to be effective, but have extreme symptoms and side effects. Basically it's like knocking someone out. They become borderline catatonic, and they can have the shakes and stuff like that. And so the newer medications in those categories try to have the same effective outcomes without the same really unsettling side effects. So there's certainly advances, but most of all, it still feels like there isn't a wonder pill. And I again, kind of referencing what I thought the mental health care world looked like, I thought we were just going to get a pill and 2 weeks later everything was going to be fine. And instead it was a ton of guessing and trying this and trying that. And so ultimately we ended up, and it's just this salt that's doing the best thing for her, So
it is lithium.
Oh yeah. Lithium's the thing that helps keep her, that hasn't had a relapse in 4 years. She's doing amazingly well in her current job, which she's had for over 5 years. I mean, lithium's the thing that helps her continue to have the life that she's always dreamed of and continue to, achieve the goals that she's always wanted to achieve, but I know that lithium has done nothing for other people. So
mental health has a stigma in the public. It's often, people often even make jokes about it. They'll make a joke, oh, you're being bipolar, these kinds of things. I think awareness about mental health is kind of peaking recently, especially in the past year. There's been some really high profile deaths and things like that. But I'm curious how you think about this, and if this is part of what you're hoping to do with your work, or how that affects you or offends you or doesn't, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that ending the stigma is absolutely essential, because due to the things that you mentioned, the fact that this is often a joke, right? The brunt of a joke, that keeps people from getting help, because it makes it feel like what their experience is something they might have to be ashamed of. I remember when Julia was first hospitalized with delusions and hearing voices, I heard a radio commercial where it was a bunch of celebrities talking about how low the prices of a car was. And then the narrator, they're like, it's crazy how low these prices are. Well, no, it's crazy how safe the car is. And then the narrator concludes, is what's really crazy is hearing voices in your head, And I'm just like, who approved that? That's like literally what's happening in my family right now. And here's someone using it as a marketing ploy, And so there have been moments where I get incredibly offended on behalf of people who experience that. But then there's others where I try to be, I think as a teacher, I maybe understand a little bit more that people can say stupid things because they just are saying it not out of hatred, but out of just ignorance. And so as long as they're willing to approach that ignorance and try to grow into a deeper understanding, then I'm willing to be a lot more patient with them,
It's a really challenging thing. I was at a business lecture not too long ago, and one of the speakers got up on stage and said, I'm so happy I just got diagnosed with ADHD, and my doctor told me every entrepreneur has ADHD, so all of you should consider Adderall. And I looked at him and I was like, that is the most irresponsible, crazy thing
unbelievable
I've ever heard. But like this kind of, I just feel like mental health is an all-time low, and education it's worse than it's ever been. Nobody knows anything about what's going on, to the point where somebody gets up in front of a stage of people and tells them all they all have ADHD and should be on Adderall. It's totally bizarre. But people will say equally bizarre things on the other side of the spectrum, saying that Xanax is the devil and all the SSRIs are should be avoided, and these kinds of things. Like, whoa, wait a minute. These things are saving lives and transforming families and things. So it's definitely a topic that's so relevant, but there's just not enough education. And it's one of those things that people don't talk about. It's present in every single family, and nobody's really addressing it publicly. We just tend to call it either derogatory, that person's so depressed in a bad way, or we just kind of sweep it under the rug.
Yeah, and I think those two poles of the spectrum that you reference is why I think it's so important that we be careful about generalizing someone's mental health experience. Xanax might be horrible for one person and life-saving for someone else. And we need to allow that those are both true, right? And kind of to get to the original question you asked me, how do you best understand if it's true? You got to have the patience to listen to what the person's experience actually is. And I think that's what's missing the most. I think our healthcare and our just sort of knee-jerk search for solutions, we're impatient. We want quick fixes, and we want it done tomorrow, and we want a cure for everyone. And that doesn't set the situation, that doesn't set the table to be like, I'm just going to sit with you for a few hours and, take the time for you to trust me, to be willing to open up to me. And once we get there, then we can actually start moving towards how we're going to help you feel better, And I think that's what we need most of all, is just a lot more patience and commitment to just like knowing that these are slow solutions, but there are solutions. They just take some time.
In service of education, I'm always big on definitions, and I think a lot of people even struggle with basic definition or differentiation between depression and anxiety, but let's leave those on the side. Let's just define bipolar disorder for people so they can differentiate that from other psychological challenges.
Bipolar disorder. So here's the other thing about these definitions. They really are categories of symptoms, right? So like if you go to the DSM-5 and look this stuff up, they'll be like well, here's 12 symptoms. And if you have 9 of these, you have this label. And if you have 8 of these, it's like, well, what happens if you have 8? Do you not have the labels? But generally, bipolar disorder means that a person experiences pretty severe mood swings between very high highs, which is called mania. And if we're just talking textbook definition here, mania, a person might feel kind of like invincible and not need sleep and feel super creative and maybe really they party a lot and spend a lot of money during mania. That's sort of like your standard experience of mania. And then they come crashing from that mania and go into the low of depression, where they'll have very low energy, not interested in doing anything, might just want to stay in bed, and might be feeling suicidal. What's challenging about bipolar is that a lot of people who get treatment, they obviously want to address the depression because it feels really crappy, but they often end up missing the mania because it feels amazing, And so this is why, unfortunately, many people with bipolar disorder end up playing their own doctor, because once they're in stable stretch for a while, they're like, oh, I'm doing fine, I don't need the medicine. And then they go take themselves off the medicine and end up becoming manic, and then unfortunately going back to the depression, Now for Julia, what's really interesting is that both of her mania and depression are actually very negative, because her mania is not like the fun, freewheeling, spending lots of money stage. Her mania actually, the lack of sleep is what drives her into experiencing delusions. And so she actually goes psychotic during mania. So it's really unfun and scary, which sucks in the moment, but I think has actually, as far as the long term, made her way more willing to get on board to address this as a problem that she needs to take care of for the rest of her life, because the high and the low both feel really bad. And she doesn't want either of them to come back. And so, fortunately, I've gotten in her a really willing partner who's like, yep, I need this medication. Yep, this self-care stuff that I'm doing is really important. I don't want to experience either of those again. And yeah.
And Mark, where do you go from here? What are you hoping to do in terms of awareness and teaching and work and opening up your family's story to the world? What are you hoping happens?
Yeah, I first off, as you said in my bio, I'm just a high school history teacher. Like, I'm just still kind of getting over the fact that I wrote a book and it got published, So I would say where I go from here is that I'm totally humbled and overwhelmed and grateful by every single person who reads this book and who takes the time to just care about my family. That's a really amazing thing. But my hope is that it becomes the beginning of a conversation that they take into their own life, to maybe it's seek help for something that they've been avoiding getting help for, or maybe it's to address how mental illness has impacted their family and they've avoided talking about that, And so I'm now also speaking publicly, not just writing about it, but I go, like I said, I went to the hospital where Julie spoke. I've spoken at colleges and businesses and hospitals just to try to get this story out there, because I do think sort of the main message of the book is that while one person gets diagnosed with an illness, there's a very complicated web of people who experience that diagnosis. So for us, our whole family goes through Julia's bipolar, and we need to work together as a family to address it, And I think that's a perspective that a lot of people, it's so obvious, but it's still very often forgotten. And so I'm trying to get out there and to keep reminding people of this, because I think that our best solutions for this is to treat everyone as if we're in this together, and not as if it's just one person, one brain, but it's really, yes, it's one person in their brain, and we need to dignify and honor that person, but we also need to dignify and honor the others who experience it. And so I'm not really sure where to go, where else we're going to keep going. I mean, I'm surprised that this book, which came out a year and a half ago, I continue to get emails about it and speaking requests. And so I'm just kind of riding this wave and seeing it. And I think the reason it has life is because it's it's speaking to an emptiness, a void that's out there of people who are talking about this experience.
I think that the hardest thing about hard things is when you don't talk about them. And so I think just opening up and opening conversations is definitely a healthy process, no matter what it is. I appreciate your work. I appreciate you coming on the show, Mark. For people who'd like to follow you, I don't know if you have a social media presence or where you'd like to send people, but if there's a good place for them to connect with you online.
Yeah, I actually have dropped off of social media because I just found it's gotten so stressful these days that it wasn't good for my self-care. So, but you're welcome to go to my website, which is Mark Lukach, that's spelled LUKACH.com. And you can, learn more about the book and see some videos and me speaking. But most importantly, you can stay in touch through email through that site. And I get these amazing emails from people who are going through their own challenges, and all of a sudden there's this little connection out there, and it feels like we're building a community, kind of one reader or one person at a time, which is really amazing. So, Lucas, I want to thank you so much for having me on your show. It was great talking to you. I really appreciate your questions.
Thanks so much, Mark. I appreciate your work, and I hope we can stay in touch for the future. If you're interested in becoming a yoga trapeze certified teacher, we have a course coming up in Barcelona at the end of November, and we still have a few spots left. This course happens to coincide with the holiday season in Barcelona, which means you will get to not only experience our teacher training course, which is world-renowned. We have over 500 graduates now teaching in a couple dozen countries, but you'll also get to see the lights get flicked on for the holiday season in Barcelona, which is beautiful. It's a really great time to be in the city. If you want to come hang out with us, come train with us, check out yogatrapezetraining.com, yogatrapezetraining.com. This week's nutritional tip is in response to a listener question. Listener Stephanie says, "Hey Lucas, should we eat fermented foods? I'm not sure if they make me feel good. Sometimes I think yes, sometimes I think no. Is it really good to eat rotten food?" I like the way that was phrased. So when you think of fermented foods, you can think of things like kombucha. You could also think of things like vinegar, sauerkraut, kimchi, natto, anything that has essentially been fermented, rotted. Bacteria have eaten, little microbes have affected this food. You can think of sour things, bubbly things. Fermented foods have been part of the human diet for a really long time. There's a bunch of very interesting things about fermented foods. For the sake of this question, let's think about fermented foods in two categories: controlled fermentation and wild fermentation. Controlled fermentation is, let's say you're making some bread and you get a little packet of yeast, you dump that yeast in and zoop, your bread rises. That's controlled because you inoculated, you stuck that yeast right into that dough, and so you controlled that fermentation process. Now, wild ferment, let's imagine that it's a warm summer day and you leave half a watermelon sitting on your picnic table in your backyard, and you come out 3 hours later and the thing smells sour and rotty. That's a wild fermentation process. Some things are controlled ferments, some things are wild ferments, and some things are kind of controlled wild. And an example of a controlled wild ferment would be something like kombucha. Kombucha's fermented in a controlled environment, but they're using a kombucha mother. If you've ever seen them, it's kind of like this big space pod thing. And this has random foreign bacteria and fungi in it. We don't really know all that's in there. Could be some good stuff, could be some bad stuff. Probably there's a bit of both. Here's the deal with fermented foods. People react totally differently at different times. You need to pay attention to what works for you and be especially cautious of the wild ferments, the kombuchas, the sauerkrauts, the kimchis, especially if they haven't been pasteurized. But sometimes, even if they have been pasteurized, they will still affect you. I personally love fermented foods. They taste amazing. I love to eat them. Sometimes they don't make me feel good. Sometimes they do. A really common example of a fermented food, a traditional fermented food, is soy sauce. Soy sauce also has a lot of histamines, and so a lot of people react to it. Many people will react to sauerkraut, kimchi. Many people even react to kombucha and vinegar, surprisingly. So you need to pay attention to how your body responds. So fermented foods could be a miracle for you. They could also be a disaster. Pay attention and use them with care. In the best case, they can totally fix digestive disorders, clear up your skin. In the worst case, they can aggravate or even instigate chronic yeast infections and jock itch and dandruff and other fungal and candida bacterial overgrowth conditions. It can totally happen. So it's something you need to take case by case. And the idea that all of us need to be eating piles and piles of rotten cabbage or piles and piles of probiotic supplements, Not really true. People react very differently. So my suggestion, Stephanie, is try each food separately, pay really close attention to how it's affecting your body, and make sure that the changes are positive. If you're ending up with gas and bloating, if you're ending up with some sort of digestive inflammation or any other telltale signs that your body's not reacting well, pay attention to that because that's very often true. Hope that's helpful. We have a question this week from JP. Listener JP says, I love your show and wanted to pick your brain about this subject for a long time. I am a yoga teacher and registered prenatal yoga teacher, as well as a trainer, and I'm currently pregnant. I am especially interested in any insight you have into nutrition during pregnancy and what supplements you would suggest during the birth year, prenatal, postpartum. Just like information on exercise during pregnancy, nutrition information seems to be outdated or limited. Any information or a podcast addressing maternal health would be useful for me and my students. I appreciate the question, JP. I'm always really hesitant to give advice for prenatal, pregnancy, postnatal, all of these things. I'm just really hesitant. So let me give one big caveat. Check with your doctor. I'll give another one. Check with your doctor. One more time, check with your doctor. This is way above my pay grade. At the same time, of course, I have kids. I've been through this. I've certainly researched this, and here's what I can tell you for sure. Okay, again, check with your doctor. So folic acid is what you'll find in all the literature. Folate is now the preferred form of this B vitamin that you want to take. I'm going to say that again. Folic acid, no. Folate, yes. All your premium prenatal vitamins will have folate. All the crappy ones will have folic acid. It's kind of a small thing, but some people react to folic acid. Folate is a better form, more bioavailable. Generally speaking, the stack that people will put you on, that doctors will put you on, is actually a pretty good stack for everyone listening. There's a whole bunch of things, like you get pregnant and suddenly the doctor says, oh, you must take vitamins. Kind of like, I think you should have been taking vitamins before. This is why I always tell people to take vitamins. But B complex in general, of which folate is one of them, but usually your doctor will put you on a B complex, which will include a whole bunch of other B vitamins. Those are really good to go on. B vitamins are plentiful in the plant-based world, but most people are slightly deficient, so those are what you will often be put on. Vitamin D3, usually with a K2 combo, is what your doctor will put you on. It is absolutely possible to overdo it on vitamin D3. I don't know anyone who's managed to do that, but in theory, it's a fat-soluble vitamin like vitamin A, so it is possible. So do definitely get your blood tested. When you get your blood tested, you'll almost certainly be low, and start taking whatever your doctor recommends. Generally speaking, people are often supplementing these days with 5,000 to 10,000 international units per day. Vitamin D is a weird one. You can megadose once a week or something if you want, and you don't have to take it every day because it's fat soluble. Again, don't mess around with that one. It's fat soluble, so make sure to check with your doctor. Iron is one that people are often put on. Iron supplements are brutal. They're one of the least tolerated supplements. It feels like you just swallowed a bunch of lead, so you feel horrible. Check with your doctor to make sure you need to take it, because if you don't and you take it, it's no good at all. But iron supplements are often needed. Prenatal anemia is a really common thing. So again, check with your doctor and then play around with different forms of supplementation. People tend to tolerate liquid supplements better. We've had a guy on the show, a Canadian guy who has this company called the Lucky Iron Fish. I have one of these iron fish. It's really simple to use. I don't get any kind of digestive problems with it. But again, make sure your doctor says, yes, you need iron, and then start using this Lucky Iron Fish, or try playing around with some liquid. There's a company in the UK that makes this liquid iron that's really popular with expecting mothers because it's pretty easy to digest. But that's a tough one because it can just really mess up your belly. Last but not least are omega-3s. And again, do check with your doctor because it does thin your blood. Omega-3s do, and that might be a bad idea. And you want to take, an EPA DHA supplement in the form of a small fish oil or an algae oil. For baby formulas and things and prenatal stuff, often algae oils are used because there's a good chance that they're safer in terms of heavy metal toxicity. Again, please do check with your doctor, but that's a really simple stack. The one other caveat that I will say is a lot of first trimester sickness revolves around supplementation, and people don't realize it. If you take iron, a B complex, omega-3s, vitamin D, and vitamin K together, the chances of you feeling horrible in your belly are like 80%. And this is very often what happens. People go from no supplements to a whole stack of supplements, and especially that iron and that vitamin K, for example, it can be in the B complex stack can be really rough on your stomach. So a lot of the morning sickness and stuff sometimes is caused by those vitamins. So pay attention, and in many cases take them with food, take them separate. Pay attention to how each of them is treating you. Certain B complexes will affect you more than others, like we talked about with iron. Certain forms of iron will affect you more than others, can disrupt your sleep and something like that. So to go from zero to go with those supplements can sometimes just make you feel horrible. So definitely get some doctor's advice. But those are my initial thoughts. I hope that's helpful. Congratulations. And send us a photo. Post a photo in the Facebook group. It'd be cool to see.
This week's iTunes review is by Laura Loretta29 from the UK. Laura Loretta29 says, I find this podcast interesting and very helpful. I've always learned something new in every one of your podcasts. Always brilliant. The topics you discuss and discover are so modern and innovative. Thank you so much for doing the podcast, Lucas. Congratulations, Laura Loretta29. You have won the Yoga Trapeze. Email us at podcast@yogabody.com and we'll get that out to you.
If you're a regular Yoga Talk Show listener, you'll definitely want to get on my email list. Go to yogabody.com/sign me up. When you enter your email address there, we always have free giveaways every month, yoga straps, water bottles, discounts in our shop, and all kinds of other things. When you sign up at yogabody.com/sign me up, I'll send you just one email a week with updates about the show, special offers, new courses, and valuable information that I think you'll find useful. So go to yogabody.com/sign me up to claim your free prize now.